In this video, we're going to go over how to name ionic compounds that contain transition metal ions. So what you're going to need to know for this is you have to remember the charge of simple ions that are from the periodic table. You're also going to have to recall about transition metal ions. For transition metal ions, remember how these ions can have different charges. For example, iron 2 has an iron with a positive 2 charge. And iron 3 is an iron with a positive 3 charge. So those Roman numerals inside the parentheses, they tell you the charge of the ion. The last thing we're going to have to remember is, ions, they are charged. However, ionic compounds, the compounds themselves is when the positive and negative charge come together. The compound themselves is neutral. All right, so try to recall that. Okay, let's take a look at our first practice problem here. We have what is Hg, which is mercury, and I2, which is iodide. We're going to need to know what the charge of mercury is because it's a transition metal. So we can write down the name for it. Okay, so mercury, what is the charge of that? We don't know yet. We just know that there's one of them. Iodide, what is the charge of that? We're going to look at the periodic table for this. Iodide is down here, so it has a -1 charge. So try to remember that. We're going to go ahead and write that down. Hg, we don't know the charge of it. However, iodide, we do know the charge. It's -1. We also know that there are 2 iodides according to the chemical formula. Okay, so we're going to write that down. So we know there's 1 mercury. We know there's 2 iodides, and each iodide is -1. So what must be the charge of mercury? Well, if the compound is supposed to be neutral, we know that this mercury has to be positive 2. Okay, the mercury has to be positive 2. So now that we know the charge of the transition metal, we can actually write the name accurately. This is mercury, but since it's a transition metal, we have to write down the charge. This is mercury 2 iodide. Okay, mercury 2 iodide. Let's go ahead and take a look at another practice problem. Here we have iron. Now, iron can have multiple charges because it's a transition metal. So what kind of charge is it? We're going to have to figure that out. And we have chloride. Chloride, what charge is that? We can figure that out. We're going to look at the periodic table. Chloride is right here. That means chloride has a -1 charge. Okay, so remember that. We're going to go ahead and write this down. We have iron. We don't know the charge of it yet, but we do have chloride, which we do know the charge of. In fact, we also know that there are 3 chlorides. There are 3 chlorides in this compound, according to the chemical formula. So if there's 1 iron and there's 3 chlorides, and each of the chlorides is -1, what must be the charge of the iron? If you guessed +3, you're right, because if there's a total of -3, there must be a total of +3 for the iron. So now we can write down the name of this transition metal. It is iron 3. Okay, it's specifically iron 3. So iron, III, chloride. Okay, let's look at one more practice problem. We have copper here, which is our transition metal, and also nitride. So copper, nitride. So what's the charge of copper? We don't know yet, but we can find out the charge of nitride. Nitride is right here. It's a -3. Okay, -3. Remember that. We're going to go ahead and list these ions. So there's copper, and there's actually 3 of these, according to the chemical formula. And then there's nitride, and we know that nitride is -3. So what must be the charge of each of these copper ions if we know that the nitride has a total of -3 charge? If you guessed +1 for each of them, you're right. They each have to have a +1 to cancel out with that nitride right there. Nitride has a -3. Okay, so we now know that the copper in this chemical formula, they are copper 1 ions. So we can write the name copper 1 nitride. Okay, so the copper are all +1 charges. Let's go ahead and look at another practice problem. We have PBS. PB is actually lead. Lead is a transition metal, and we need to know the charge of lead. Do we know the charge of sulfur? We should be able to get that. Let's look at the periodic table. So sulfur is always going to be -2. Try to remember that. We have Pb, there's only one according to chemical formula. There's also S, there's only one according to the chemical formula, but we do know it's -2. So what must be the charge of Pb, or lead? It's got to be, if you think +2, you're right. It's got to be +2. So now we should know the name of the chemical for Pb, the transition metal. It's going to be lead-2. Lead-2, because it's got a +2 charge. So lead-2 sulfide. Lead-2 sulfide. Let's look at one last example. In our last example, we have Fe2O3. Okay, iron is our transition metal here. So we're going to have to figure out the charge of iron. And then O is oxide. Oxide always has the same charge. So let's figure out the charge. It's right there, so it has a -2 charge. Try to remember that. So iron, Fe, we don't know the charge of it yet. We do know, according to the formula, that there's 2 of them. O is oxide. We just figured out the charge of it. It's -2. And according to the chemical formula, there's 3 of these. Okay. What must be the charge of these iron ions? Well, we do know that all the oxides have a total of -6. So what must be each of these iron ions? If you're thinking +3, then you're right. Each of the iron ions must be +3 so that it'll cancel out with the -6 total, all right? So we now know the charge of this transition metal. It's at +3. So when we write the chemical formula, when we write the chemical name, the iron is iron 3. So iron 3 oxide, all right? So that's kind of it. This is a little bit challenging because you do need to kind of balance the charge to figure out the name of the transition metal. I'm sure you're capable of doing this. There's one note about the transition metals. So here's a note. The transition metal ions, there are some exceptions. Namely, there's zinc and silver. Okay, so the exception is that zinc is always +2. So since it doesn't really transition, you're just always going to write zinc instead of zinc 2. Okay, you're just going to write zinc instead of zinc 2. Same thing with silver. Silver is always +1. Even though it's a transition metal, it's always going to be +1. So you're just going to write silver, not silver 1. So just write silver instead of silver 1. So we have some examples down below. ZnCl2. Okay, well, zinc is going to be just zinc chloride. Okay, and then we have Ag2SO3. Okay, well, Ag is a transition metal. However, it's one of the exceptions. So it's just going to be silver sulfite. Okay, so you're not going to write the Roman numeral for these 2 transition metals. The reasoning is because they're always going to be the same charge. Alright, so try to remember these 2 exceptions. Okay, you can go ahead and try some examples on your own. And after you try those examples, if you want to check your work, you can go ahead and take a look at the answer key.